I'm Alexandra Kennedy. I come from Ecuador. I've been here most of my life and I consider myself Ecuadorian, even though my father is said to be from Dublin. And at home we spoke English and Spanish. But I had all sorts of problems being bicultural because Ireland was always a powerful country, even though it was so poor at that time. We were talking about the 1960s. But he also believed that he was from England, and that made him and his family even powerful. And while I was growing up, as an Ecuadorian, I wasn't sure what I was because I was speaking both languages, because I dressed differently, because I went to the American school, and I had this subtle feeling that I was from nowhere, but I wanted to be from somewhere. And my father kept on saying that this country was a God-forsaken country, that it had no value at all, that people were not intelligent, and that indigenous people were just like animals. As he saw while we were driving, for instance, from the capital Quito to Guayaquil, the Indians used to drink themselves to tears, and you would find them on the streets, on the highways. Most of the people in Quito in the 1960s would be barefooted. The whole city had a very bad smell because nobody washed, hygiene was very poor, and everything was very poor in this country. So he kept on saying that this country had no history, that people had no history here, that this was, that Ecuador would never progress, that they were not as intelligent as Europeans. The same kind of discurso that you can hear from Trump and others, and which means 40 years after, 40 or 50 years after my father kept on saying these things. My father said that everybody was corrupt, that everybody broke the law, that he could not make business here because it was so hard. Laws were sort of coming in and out, and it was a very disruptive kind of place. But I loved it, and I really loved it. And as soon as I was old enough, I decided that I would prove to my father, and through him as a symbol of Europe, or as a symbol of powerful countries, that Ecuador, this tiny little country in the Pacific coast of South America, had its lovely long history, that it started about 12,000 years ago, that we have had this sort of downfall, if that could be said, because of two moments of colonization, because the Incas had colonized pre-Columbian Indian groups, and because immediately after 80 years of having the Incas here, we were colonized by the Spaniards. And that never finished. That was an never-ending job, because in 1820, 1830, when we got through our colonization, the Spanish colonization, immediately we got England into the picture, and France into the picture, and Holland into the picture. So, as I always say, our minds were colonized, not just our territories. Our minds, our economies, our projects, our religion, everything was colonized. And even now, when I speak to my students, I have been teaching for the last 40 years, I always tell them that the only way we're going to be decolonized, as a scholar would say, and many of the postmodern thinkers, is to believe in the first place that this is worth it. And that the poorest country on earth, the poorest city on earth, the poorest person on earth is worth it. And that we have behind us, behind the Indian history, meaning India, behind this history in Ecuador, or behind the history in Burma, there's a beautiful story to tell. And it is for us, locals, to start writing history and telling history and having the people really get empowered through that. I can feel it in a classroom. I mean, as soon as I get into teaching Latin American art history and architectural history, the first thing I start is to sort of try to play with their minds in terms that we're not only dependent of, but we're capable of doing this, and we have been capable of doing the rest. So I think the only way of really creating progress and really creating in very good, simple terms, our response to our own problematic and our own little things is by knowing the place and being absolutely committed to to working for the country. I always remember one day when I was finishing my master's thesis at Tulane University in New Orleans, the dean of the art history department, who was a very nice lady, German lady. She was specialized in Byzantium art. She said to me, "I have a plan for you. You must go first to Berlin. It was the best art history school in Europe. You must learn German there for a year. We're going to give you a scholarship for you to have to take your doctorate in Berlin, and then I'm going to send you to the Metropolitan Museum in New York." And it was a tremendous thing to offer at such a young kid. And I said, "No." And she said, no, come on. I mean, you must be absolutely crazy. And I said, "No." And she said, please go back to your house and think about it for 15 days. And I thought about it, but I always said no, because I thought if our countries let people go, and everybody wants to go to New York, and everybody wants to go to Rome or Berlin or anywhere, we're never going to build our own places, our own small places, where our own identities, where global issues, of course, concern us, but we have to really create local issues here and to address local issues. And I think we have to play with both. But if there's nobody here, and at that time it was the 1970s, 1980s, everybody wanted to leave. I mean, all of the people that were like me, I was very fortunate that my parents could give me a very good school. Then I had very good universities where I went to. But I was sort of the minority. I mean, we could count in maybe 2-3% of the population could do it. Plus, my father was a feminist in a way. He said that his girls should go and study university. And most macho men, Ecuadorians, said that women had to be secretaries and men were the ones to study. So, I mean, I was very fortunate in many ways. And I had to take advantage, and I had to sort of repay what I had gotten out of life and in my family. And
that's a fantastic attitude, Alex.
I think it was a generation. I think because there were, I can remember like maybe 10, 15 people that did the same as me. And we were all dedicated to create and to learn about our own heritage. But it was a tiny group. And we all came back. I remember maybe 10, 12 people. We came back and we were discussing, we would have coffee together, we would be like delighted to start everything from scratch, really it was from scratch. The Instituto Nacional de Patrimonio Cultural, the Heritage Center for, what is it called, the National Heritage Center. I mean, that was created by us. The Academy of History, I was the first woman to get into the Academy of History, which was very, very exciting. I was 26 at that time. And then I was the first teacher, as a woman, to be a teacher at the Catholic University in Quito, and I was 22. And I think it was because I had such a drive, and I was so forceful in trying to build things, and with this group, because I think there was an architect and there was a historian, and I mean there was a little group that did all of these things. A little group in Quito, a little group in Cuenca, and a little group in Guayaquil. And we were all in the same kind of thinking, of feeling that we were been so privileged to have schooling. I mean, nobody had it. Nobody had shoes. I mean, we had everything.
Well, I particularly applaud the idea that you stated earlier that every single person is worth it. You know, every single person out there is worth the effort, and what you're trying to give back and make your country better.
Well, that's one of my exercises in the classroom, because sometimes I ask they're 19, 20, and I ask them, where are they from? And they tell me, like, Cuenca. And I say, oh. And after 2 or 3 months I find out that they come from a tiny little indigenous town somewhere in Cañar, a place where there are lots of indigenous people. And I said, why didn't you tell me that? And it's because he's ashamed. And this is 2017. He's ashamed to come from a place that is from indigenous background. And if I ask him if somebody speaks Quechua, the local language of the indigenous people in the mountainous part of Ecuador, nobody will answer. Nobody, everybody will say no. So it's like everything is sort of it's trying to disappear itself as a language, as a culture, or even if you ask them, I mean, half of my students have indigenous names, Quechua names, and they have no idea of where they come from. I mean, they would never recognize that that is an indigenous name. And if I say it, they will feel insulted. So you have to be very careful in how you step on things, because as they see you white and they see you're like a gringa, and they always feel you're superior, always. I mean, and that's desperate because I haven't worked for that. You know what I mean? It's not the skin that ties you to anything or gives you value or anything, but you see, whites have always been in the powerful part of this scenery. So. Yeah, it's very difficult to play with skin things. For instance, now my students, when they're sort of darkish, it's so difficult for them. I mean, you can always see them in the first rows. The whites are there, sort of whitish, darkish, but the others are sort of somewhere else where you can't see them. I mean, and this is a symbol of many other things that come behind it. I mean, for instance, I asked them if they eat mote, which is this white corn. People will not put their hands up. We all eat mote, but they won't tell you they do because they're ashamed.
So the newer generations are shifting that mentality, the younger Cuencanos who are growing up?
I think it has shifted a lot. But in places like Cuenca, it's still very, very difficult. I think things have shifted in Quito, where there has been a tremendous indigenous movement, or in Riobamba, where you have a tremendous amount of Protestants coming into Riobamba and working with the indigenous group. And I mean American Protestants. But in places like Cuenca, where there, until about 20 years, there were 10 to 15 families that that had everything, and that were powerful, and that had the decisions, and that were the mayors of the city, and this, and the bishop of Cuenca. It was very bad. When I first came here, this was 1986, it was very, very bad. I mean, it was so stratified that you could feel that people just couldn't move from where they came from. Like the castes, I suppose it's like castes in India. But here it's very subtle because people want to be from the high upper classes. They want to change everything. I mean, they don't value where they come from. I mean, they just, if they have some kind of money, they get into the best school, the American school, the German school, and then they try to forget about their origins. It's what happens with all of the migrants going to the States or Spain or Italy. When you find migrants that come from Romania, they know their folk songs, they know their little stories about Romania, they know how they dress, they know how to, but when an Ecuadorian goes somewhere else, they forget about their origins. And I always think it's because they don't know very much about their origins, but also because they just want to, what we call it, blanquear, to whiten yourself. So you must sort of just dive into and think you're going to be an American citizen. You're never going to be an American citizen. You're a Latino. And you're always going to be very badly treated in the States because you're a Latino. Right now, maybe after 50 years, Latinos might be interesting for a place like the United States. But right now, no. I mean, and it's like, it's always wanting to be what you're not. That's what this thing causes. And especially people that are very poor and that have had to migrate to the States or Spain. It's the same in Spain. I mean, you can see them. You can see the Ecuadorians in the streets. You can see how they drink a lot. They make all sorts of strange moves in large, big avenues in Madrid. And then you find that they're not part of it. I mean, but they try to be. But then they drink so much and then they do all sorts of awful things, and so they're going to jail or they're murdering their little. So this is the idea that, for instance, Italians or Spaniards would have about Latinos. I mean, it's like.
Do you think, Alex, that it's an identity crisis?
Oh yeah.
That
definitely
still
yes.
exists very much.
And I think that's why I was telling you my story, because I had an identity crisis in a different way. I mean, I had this powerful, again, biculturally, this powerful part of myself who came from Europe, and the other one, the one with no power, that is the Ecuadorian side. And in this case, it would be sort of the white, mestizo whites, and the indigenous. I mean, the same identity crisis, but as a whole. And trying to solve it, it's not as easy as trying to solve your own personal identity crisis. I mean, solving it in a more of a general way, it's much more difficult because it needs a really political stance there. I think this government has done a bit to it and for it, but very few politicians are into it still. I think places like Bolivia with Evo Morales are extremely interesting because he's an Indian and he speaks the local language and he talks about coke in the way that Bolivians talk about it. Coke is not the white powder that makes people millionaires and you can just sniff it. And I mean, that has nothing to do with our cultures and our relation to coke. It's totally different. And he knows how to put this on the table. I mean, he knows how to do it, and he does it sort of very nicely, very sweetly. So people feel that if they have an indigenous president, if he's capable of being the president, if he's capable of saying that coke is not a tremendous thing, but it's something as part of the culture. I remember walking in Santa Cruz in Bolivia, and they were having lunch. This builder were having lunch, and they were drinking coke and bananas and eating coke leaves. I mean, that's part of their, because they need, they need it for every day. That's how they live. So it's not drugging yourself. I mean, that comes from states. That comes from these organized, powerful countries. I mean, the whole thing is ridiculous. I mean, it's like we are always using foreign models